Hi, welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thiel, and we are looking at this week passages from Genesis chapter 25, verse 19 through 28, verse 9, Malachi chapter 1 through to chapter 2 and verse 7, and Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 13. I hope everyone had a good week of study, being able to grab these passages and just look at them throughout each day of the week and kind of slowly digest them has been a really great process for me. I'm learning a lot more than I have in the past few years going through this reading program, and mostly because I have like this pressure on myself to make sure I'm ready to be able to record a teaching from the passages, and so I'm trying to be as in-depth as possible, as opposed to the last couple of years. I would maybe fall behind a couple of weeks and then read a bunch of passages all at once, trying to catch up. That would happen more often than not. So this has been an encouragement to me, and really I have been enjoying it. I am learning so much, so it's been great, and also like solving some of these issues. Like the Romans chapter 9 passage, I admit I've read it before. I've sat through Bible studies, but I never really was happy with some of the teachings I've received from people through those chapters. But now studying it in light of the Torah and the readings like Genesis and Micah, and then seeing Romans, holding them all together, it makes much more sense. Hopefully I can kind of tie that in for you as well. So let's look at, as an intro, just the concepts that we're covering here is we're moving on from Abraham, the father of the faith, in that sense, the very first one to receive that blessing of covenant, to be able to bless all the nations of the earth. You remember Genesis, we start with just Adam and Eve, and it's their purpose to fulfill the earth and dominate it and to hold sway or have power over the animals, and they failed in that in their sin. And then the way of Cain ruled, where people were able to kill each other and not fear any vengeance or any kind of revenge on them. And so God then started over with Noah, and he instituted there the death penalty. He says, okay, no more free killing, the way of Cain. And then he also gave a covenant. The first time there's like a covenant given, and that covenant is given with Noah and the whole, and all the earth, and saying, I'm not going to flood the earth anymore. And then you get to Abraham and then the covenant there. And so we're moving on from that, and kind of like this kind of big span of years or whatever, and going into the life of Isaac. And if you notice, like most of this reading kind of covers like the main parts of Isaac's life and what's important to him. And now everything is going to revolve. All of the storylines are going to revolve around that covenant that Abraham was given, that through him all the nations would be blessed. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's something that I'm keeping in my mind as I study, and I'm looking through it, and I'm just like, okay, this is going to be the theme now as we look at every story that we come across. What is the covenant that God gave Abraham, and how is this story telling us about the covenant and where it's going in terms of the future history of the people of Israel? So moving on from Abraham, we look at Isaac's life, and we see that there are some similarities just in these chapters between Isaac and his father. I know I put down there's famine. Isaac's going to deal with that in the next chapter, in chapter 26, where he goes to Abimelech again and has a similar experience that his dad had. He also has a barren wife who's also, in his eyes, beautiful, but not just in his eyes, knowing like everyone else is going to think she's beautiful. He tells the same lie his father told, that she's my sister, so that he would protect himself, so that he has that similar experience. Then he has a dispute over wells that Abraham also had with Abimelech and his people, and then ending with a covenant in that scenario with Abraham and with both of them, really. And then problems. They both have problems with prosperity, like they grow in their wealth, and then there's problems related to that. With Abraham, it was splitting from from Lot, his nephew. Then there's a lot of conflict between their two sons. Now, a little different. Isaac has his own two sons with Abraham. With the same mother, and with Abraham, he has two sons, but different mothers. And so the source of the conflict is different, but is the same also. They have in both scenarios, you have parents who kind of look at one child with a special favor over another, and that's actually what kind of leads to the conflict. With Isaac, Rebecca sees Jacob and she loves Jacob, and Isaac sees Esau and he loves Esau. For some reason, they have this disconnect where you have twins are born at the same time, but each parent is favoring a different child, and so that leads to conflict later on in the family. And with Abraham, it makes more sense. Sarah doesn't want Ishmael around, so there's conflict, and he loves Ishmael, and he's got Isaac. They also got two Isaac. That is a little more logical. Why Isaac and Rebecca have this favoritism thing going on, I don't know, but it's there, right? So similar issues there, conflict with the faithfulness between faithfulness to their sons, and then finally the passing on of the covenant of God to the next generation is also similar for Isaac as well as Abraham. And really that's the focus here. The focus is the covenant of God, because these stories, as you read them, you don't keep that in view. It can be like, what are these random stories about? Why are we giving them? And so that, like I said before, I really think focusing on understanding the covenant that God has given to Abraham and how that's different from the very beginning of the earth and creation and going on from Adam and through Noah. Like God singling out Abraham, giving him a specific covenant to bless all the earth in light of what happened with the flood, and then to see God's plan for saving humanity in that sense from himself is really key to really understanding all of what God is doing in the story of the Bible, going up to Jesus and everything else, and even for us today. All right, so let's look at the story. What I starting off with is telling the story two nations, Jacob versus Esau. So we're going to look at the Jacob versus Esau story. In chapter 25, the passage starts with chapter 25, verse 19. It's called Toldot, or generations. And so you can see there in verse 19, now these are the genealogies of Isaac, Abraham's son. So the phrase genealogies, generations, these are the generations of Isaac. That's where we get the title of this week's reading. And so it tells us Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. And at the beginning of their marriage, in verse 21, he prays to Adonai on behalf of his wife, and she's barren. And Adonai answers his plea, and his wife is pregnant. So I said that was a similarity with Abraham, where he had he also had a barren wife. The difference would be that Isaac's prayer for a child is answered sooner than Abraham, and then also it's a different blessing in that he has twins. So in verse 22, Rebecca's feeling this struggle inside of her, and she says, "Why is this happening to me?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. I put a note there because, what does that mean? There's not really any clear indication as to exactly what that meant. Maybe just a thought, like she went to a prophet, someone who was known to be a prophet. Certainly, Abraham's story tells us that there was a priest in Melchizedek, and so there were people that God would be using that we don't know a complete history of, right? But so maybe she went to go speak to someone like that. I know what it means in terms of Deuteronomy and we'll even go back Leviticus and Numbers and the creation of Urim and Thummim and the rolling of lots and what that meant to inquire of the Lord. But we don't get the creation of that system until the Exodus from Egypt. So I don't know. So it's just really, that was interesting to me. But so she went to inquire of God, and it's reported that God says to her that there are two nations in your womb, and two peoples from your body will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other people, but the older shall serve the younger. And what's interesting there is the reading in Romans makes reference to this idea that's quoted for us in the book of Malachi. In Malachi, it says at the beginning, so Malachi chapter 1, an oracle, the word of Adonai to Israel by Malachi. I loved you, says Adonai, but you say, how have you loved me? Was Esau not Jacob's brother? It is the declaration of Adonai. Yet I loved Jacob, and Esau I hated. Okay, so he loved Jacob, but Esau he hated. And going to the Romans passage, we can see there that Paul actually quotes from Malachi in his teaching there. So it's there in verse 12. It says, "And it was said to her," he's talking about Rebekah having twins. I should probably go back. It goes, "At this time I will come and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but Rebekah having twins from one act with our father Isaac. Yet before the sons were even born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose and choice might not stand because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I love, but Esau I hated." And so Paul is introducing in Romans a really interesting concept about God's will and choice over people, and specifically his purpose and choice about who will follow him and who won't, right? And it says, "And choice might not stand because of works, but because of him who calls." Meaning God makes choices and he calls people. And so it's not about their ability to earn anything from God to work, but to be called and then to respond to that call. Just like Abraham, right? Abraham, why was Abraham chosen? We don't know. We know that God saw, actually we do know, right? Genesis chapter 18, that God believed that he would be the one that could charge his household and his sons to keep the way of the Lord. And so God chooses him, and Abraham responds in faith and obeys. What Paul is saying here is that for whatever reason, Jacob and Esau, you have twins being born, they're fighting with each other from the very beginning, and it's Jacob who's the one he calls, not Esau. And the language is so strong, it says, referring back to Malachi, it says, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." And the question arises, does this mean that God predestined Esau to be someone he hated and Jacob someone that he loved? That's a really interesting question. It's a really interesting question. Let's look at what the scriptures tell us, and I think we get a clearer picture of what's happening. So traditionally, rabbinic literature, so it's I like to look at some of the Jewish sources around the scriptures, especially the Torah, because they don't have the viewpoint of always Jesus. Every commentary I read from Christianity is always like Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And sometimes I just want to know a little bit about more in-depth information that comes from their faith or from their structure of religion and how they see it. So traditionally, rabbinic literature make Jacob and Esau like this black and white contrast of each other. So Esau is seen as the embodiment of evil. Really, really kind of interesting perspective there. So you have Jacob is like the embodiment of everything that's good, and of course of themselves. Esau is the embodiment of evil. And so they connect these dots with these portions from scripture. So in Deuteronomy chapter 25, Moses is instructing the people. Let me pull that up here. So Deuteronomy chapter 25, and starting in verse 17, it says, "Remember what Amalek did to you along the way as you came out from Egypt, how he happened upon you along the way and attacked those among you in the rear, all the stragglers behind you. When you were tired and weary, he did not fear God. Now when Adonai your God grants you rest from all the enemies surrounding you in the land of Adonai, your God is giving you as inheritance to possess, you are to blot out the memory of Amalek from the heavens." Their first appearance, so what's being referred to here in Deuteronomy chapter 25, this is Moses speaking to the people as he's prepared to send them out. And, they're going in the promised land. He's not going. And so what he's referring to is back in Exodus chapter 17, there was this famous battle. It was right after the people escaped from Egypt. The Amalekites attack Israel, or they attack the nation of Israel as they are now in the wilderness and leaving Mount Sinai. And so Moses is like taken up to like a high hill, and Joshua is leading the battle. And it said that every time that Moses held up his staff, Joshua would win. And then every time Moses got tired and his hand went down holding the staff, then Joshua would start to lose. And so then they propped up his arm up with the staff up in the air so that he wouldn't keep going down because he was tired. And then finally Joshua wins the battle. And the Amalekites are said to be a descendant of Esau. That's their tradition, their understanding of where the Amalekites came from. In Numbers chapter 24, if you remember the famous story of Balaam and Balaam's donkey, what was going on there was that Balaam was being asked to curse the Israelites, right? They see the people he's working for, they see that the Israelites are growing and they keep winning like the Amalekites back in the beginning of their wandering, and now they're getting closer to the end of their wandering. And Balaam is being paid, hey, I want you to go and curse these people so that they don't win anymore. And there's the famous story of Balaam and his donkey, where every time his donkey kept turning away because his donkey kept seeing an angel that was ready to kill Balaam, because God's saying, you're not going to curse my people. I'm not going to let you curse them. So like the third time, the donkey says, hey, why are you kicking me? Can't you see him? And then Balaam opens his eyes, or his eyes are open, and he realizes there's this angel standing in front of him. And so in chapter 24 of that of Numbers, which follows the whole Balaam's donkey stuff, Balaam realizes, I can't curse these people. God's not going to let me. If I do, he's going to kill me. And so he reads. He's standing up there, ready to what the people who are paying him are thinking he's going to do. They think he's going to curse the people of Israel, but instead he says this. He says, "This is the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, and the oracle of a strong man whose eye has been opened." He's talking about being able to see the angel and God's judgment upon him. He says, the oracle of one hearing God's speech, one seeing Shaddai's vision, one fallen down, yet with open eyes. He says, how lovely your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings. So what he ends up doing is he blesses them. And in verse 7 says, his king will be greater than Agag. His kingdom will be exalted. God is bringing him out of Egypt. He will crush. So you see, this is all blessings and blessings and blessings. Then Balak he's the one who was paying Balaam to put together this curse, gets angry, and then what he ends up doing is cursing another group. So I'm just trying to get to the verse. It says Edom. So there it goes. Edom will be. So he will crush the foreheads of Moab. Remember, Moab is descended from Lot. Edom will be conquered. That's one of the descendants of Esau. In fact, the word Edom comes from Esau and his the description of his body and the fact that he wanted to eat the lentil stew, and it's just derived his name. That name Edom is derived from that sound. And then it says in verse 20, then he saw Amalek, so he uttered his oracle and said, Amalek will be the first of nations that will come to ruin at last. And he says in verse 21, then he saw the Kenite, so he uttered the oracle. So every time he's seeing like these different people, groups of people that want him to curse Israel, he just names them and is cursing them instead. And 3 of the groups that are mentioned in this curse are tied to Esau. I will say that the Kenites are believed to be descended from Esau, but definitely the Amalekites and the Edomites are descended from him. And so that's just to point out, Esau is seen as the ancestor to all of Israel's enemies, and so he's cursed, and that's why Malachi says, Esau I hated. And what's also interesting in the book of Esther, I'm not going to go there, but in the book of Esther, Haman, who, if you're not familiar with the story of the book of Esther, Haman is this character who wants to kill all the Jewish people throughout the kingdom, and he tells the king to do this, and then it's Esther who comes, with her wisdom and just grace is able to save or give her people an opportunity to fight back, and so the people are saved. And then Haman he gets hung on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and so there's a sense of judgment. And Haman himself, the character himself, is believed to also be a Amalekite, the descendant from Amalek. And so in that story, he's the picture of like ultimate evil. And who does he descend from? He descends from Esau. And then the final enemy of Israel would be Rome. And so rabbinic literature have have, let's say, the final enemy, meaning before the fall. The last fall of Jerusalem was in 70 A.D. Hadrian and the emperor and all this other stuff that was going on tied into Esau as well. So the belief that they have that throughout all their time, it's Esau and Esau and Esau and his descendants that are their problem when it comes to their enemies and who they have to fight and who they have to go up against. This is their the trouble that they face. And the question does arise, why? Why is it this way? And so we read already Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 13. And it seems that God chose Esau for this purpose. Like, I'm going to give Isaac 2 sons, and to Isaac's, one of his sons are going to be the the ancestor of the people that are going to be the ones to bless all the world to their seed, and that's going to be Jacob. The other son is going to be destined to give birth to all of the future enemies of Israel. And again, is this the way God works? Does he predestine people to be enemies, his enemies? Does he predestine other people to be chosen? Certainly, this is where, denominations over, almost 2,000 years now have been arguing about this stuff. I'm not going to solve it here, but this is kind of where all of this comes from, this idea of predestination and how God chooses and who becomes what, and whether someone's a Calvinist, Arminian, and all this other stuff. But what I want to do is just look back at the text. So I just want to answer the question as to why. Why does Esau become the picture of everyone that's now an enemy to Israel throughout their story? Why is it him? Why is he that picture? And it comes down to a decision that he made in regards to his birthright. So in chapter 25, it tells us that Esau was out hunting, and he was a huntsman. Jacob was more mild. He stayed inside. That's where it tells us that Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game. So Rebekah loved Jacob. So basically, Isaac's like, I love the way he goes and hunts and he cooks for me, and I like that. And later on, he does ask Esau, like, hey, prepare for me, like, this meal that I love, and then I'll give you my blessing. So, I mean, if it's that simple, it's that simple. Isaac loves Esau more because he can hunt and prepare good food for him. And so Jacob prepares this stew, and Esau comes in and he's hungry. So he's gone out. We don't know if he got anything or not. Hunting can be tough in the wilderness. And he's hungry, and Jacob says, okay, sell me your birthright. Now, what does a birthright mean in this culture? As in a lot of cultures, the rights to, like, inheritance of an estate belong to the firstborn. And so Esau, we were learned at the time of their birth, Esau was born, and Jacob was holding on to his heel, just to indicate, like, even though Esau was first, Jacob's very close behind him, and he's not that far away. But still, Esau's the one who is seen to have the birthright, or the rights to inheritance, estate, whatever it is that he's going to get. And we'll see later it's related to the blessings. And so Jacob wants that. So what we see is Jacob, in this interaction, we see that Jacob values the birthright. He wants it. Okay. And Esau spurns it, or he despises it. So in verse 32, he says, look, I'm about to die. Whatever uses to me is this, a birthright. And so it sounds like he's so hungry, he's saying, this is not that important to me. I'm about to die. Just let me eat. But in verse 34, at the end of the story, he says, Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and he drank, and he got up and he left. So Esau despised his birthright. In Robert Alter's version, he says that Esau spurned his birthright. And so I did an exegesis of the word in Hebrew, and it means to look down on with contempt. So it means to deliberately reject or dismiss the significance of something. So when you have contempt for something, you look at this thing and you're like, it really doesn't matter to me. It's not enough to just be like, oh, I really don't care. That's cool. You have your own interests. It's like someone brings up country music to you, and they're talking about their country music, and they're talking about Blake, whoever, and as they talk, they tell you about Blake, whatever. You look at them, and you really don't care. Not only don't you not care, you just don't want to hear it anymore. You actually kind of hate it, and you say, you know what? I'm not really into country music. I don't want to talk about this. And you turn around and walk away. That's what it means to spurn someone, right? Usually we think about it in terms of love, like, oh, her love was spurned, his love was spurned. And so, it's like Steve Urkel and Laura Winslow, if you're old enough to know those stories, how often Laura just spurned Steve's love. Every time he would ask her out, Laura, my darling, give her flowers and buy her gifts. And her reaction was, I don't want anything from you, not until like the end of the series. But for the most part, right, for however many years that show was on TV, she spurned his love for her. She just looked down at it with contempt, didn't want it. And that's the word, that's the phrase, the idea of how Esau felt about his birthright. He didn't just give it up. He gave it up because he didn't really care about it. He thought to himself, this is not important to me. And so he gave it up. And you have to think about this. The covenant of God with Abraham goes back some years, but still it belongs to Isaac now, right? Abraham is passed and he's given the blessing to his father. What does he have to pass on to his son? You read that Isaac, there was a famine. Isaac had to get up and go. He didn't have much. And then he leaves the Abimelech's land with cattle and stuff. So he had to regrow. It seems like whatever it was that Abraham had, and he passed on to Isaac at the end. I don't know what happened to it all, but it did seem like Isaac had to kind of rebuild. Maybe because of the famine, he lost stuff, whatever. He kind of had to rebuild. But what was his main inheritance that he got from his father? The only piece of land he has is the land that he was able to bury Sarah and Abraham to, a piece of land that Abraham had to spend a lot of money to get. And so he has that land, and he has the covenant that God gave his father Abraham. And I could imagine that Abraham would always tell Isaac about this covenant, about this promise God gave him, that we're going to bless the whole world through, God's going to bless the whole world through us, and you're my seed, and you're going to be the one that's going to bless the world. And so I could see him also, Isaac, then in turn telling his own sons about that. I know I do that with my daughter. I'll tell her stories and things that come from generations in the past. And so I could, definitely see that Esau knows what his inheritance is, what his birthright is, to be the one to be the seed to then bless the entire nation, to have this covenant, going back to Genesis chapter 12. And it's this reaction that he has to that birthright that tells us more about his character. That he is somebody that when it comes to the things of God, seems to not care so much about those things. That's what this story with the stew is trying to tell us. That Esau isn't simply chosen to be hated by God. More like he proves why God looks at Esau and says, yeah, this is not the guy. Because he knew that Esau would have this attitude towards the covenant, the promise that he gave to Abraham that was then passed to Isaac. He knew that of the two sons, it would be Jacob who would want the covenant, who would want the birthright, who would treat it with respect and see it as something that's highly valued. And he was cunning in the way he obtained it from his brother, because it belonged to his brother. And so God would see the difference between the two. And so really what Esau is a picture to us of is, you have this potential relationship with God that can be great, but your attitude towards that relationship with God and the potential of that relationship is, yeah, I don't want this. I don't want this relationship. And certainly I know people, you probably know people, that as they look at the opportunity to have a relationship with God, they look down on it, they spurn it, they reject it because they say, well, what do I have to, I don't really want to give up what I have to do that if that's something that God is calling them to do. Reminds me of the rich man who Jesus said, go ahead and sell all of your things to the poor and then come follow me. And the guy's like, oh, yeah, no. It says that he was sad and he walked away, but it's like, come on, like that's the one thing you need. Like, how sad can you be? It's just, you just don't want to let that go. And so in that sense, people over time in history have had the opportunity to choose God in his way and everything that comes along with it, or not. And those who don't become the kind of people that then will go after the people that accept it. and go in God's way. So predestination, whatever, I don't know. I see more just God saw what Esau's heart was going to be like. He knew what Esau was going to be like. He knew what Jacob was going to be like. And Esau's decisions, just like Pharaoh's decisions, proved what God already thought of and knew about them. And so that's kind of how that works. Now, obviously, Paul says that God kind of made these choices, and what I think he's saying is he had two kids, so that one could do one and one could do the other, and it was Esau who ended up going that way, and Jacob that went the other way, and so that's later on. It's Malachi who says in the prophecy from God, it's Esau I hated, and what it's a reference to is going back to the time in this moment with this story of how Esau rejected the covenant with God by trading it for lentil soup. Now, Jacob, on the other hand, he knows the value of the birthright, right? He wants it. But in chapter 27, you have that story of how he deceives his father to get the blessing. So he's gotten the birthright. He got a pledge from his brother. Birthright belongs to him. But Isaac still wants to bless Esau. And so Rebekah overhears this, and they come up with a plan to deceive Isaac so that Jacob could receive the blessing over Esau. And again, Jacob and Rebekah, they're motivated by the promises of this covenant and what this blessing entails and what it's going to mean for Jacob and his line. And again, Rebekah loves Jacob. He was, seems like he was home and he liked to be there. And so whatever, but she was looking out for him. But it doesn't excuse their behavior. In Genesis chapter 27, he goes so far as to cover himself. Hopefully everybody read, this is actually a detail I didn't know earlier. First, Rebekah has him wear Esau's clothes, and then she puts on the skin of the animal that they killed, the goats or whatever, so that when Isaac touched Jacob, he would feel the hairiness, be like, okay, it feels like Esau, even though I hear Jacob. And then it says at the end of the interaction, he says, come closer to me. And it says that he smells Esau. So in verse 15, it says, Rebekah also took her elder son Esau's favorite clothes and put them on. Why? Because of what it would smell like. The smell would remind Isaac of his son and say, oh, that's him. And that's so in verse 21, here, come closer so I can feel you, my son, whether you're not really my son Esau. And Jacob came closer and he felt him. That's when he feels the animal's hair on his hands. He's like, oh, those are Esau's, because Esau was a hairy guy. Jacob was all smooth, apparently. And then he says, are you really my son? But you can tell Isaac is still not sure. And then it says to him, bring me some of my son's wild game so that I can bless you. And all this is happening because Isaac can't see, and his eyes are dim. It just means he's losing his eyesight. And so in verse 27 is when he says, and when he came closer and kissed him, when he smelled the smell of his clothes, he blessed him. So, and he says, behold, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field that Adonai has blessed. So they took a lot of steps, Rebekah and Jacob, to deceive Isaac into thinking that he was Esau. And is this okay? No, it's not. And what Jacob's story tells us, as we get into the next portion next week, you're already kind of familiar. I've mentioned it before. Jacob goes to his uncle Laban, Rebekah's brother, to find a wife, and you see that that's a result of this whole ordeal. Jacob's actions of deceit leads to his brother wanting to murder him. His mother is afraid. She tells Isaac that we need to send Jacob back home so that he can find a bride, so he won't marry a Canaanite like Esau did. Esau overhears that, so not only, and then so he feels bad, and then he goes to marry an Ishmaelite because he's like, oh, I'll marry, one of my uncle's sons, or my uncle's daughters. I'll go marry her. Like maybe that'll make dad happy. And so what you really see, as a result of all this deception, is this total fracturing of the family. And that's the sign of destructive behavior and sinful behavior. There's no two ways about it. What Jacob and Rebekah did here was wrong. I don't know if Isaac was wrong in purposely intending to give it to Esau, maybe because Esau had sold the birthright. Maybe Isaac didn't know that Esau had done that. Maybe he did, and so they felt like they had to deceive him. Whatever the reasonings are, whatever the justifications are, you can see in the results of what ends up happening in the family's life as a result of the sin is that it wasn't right. And Jacob's going to learn and grow from this experience, as will Esau. He will also grow up and mature and love his brother. But in time, as time forwards out and just moves forward, you're going to see the descendants of Esau continue with that heart of spurning the covenant of God and his people and wanting to kill them. So that early heart of sin, that murderous desire that Esau has towards his brother, is going to be passed on to his children. And it reminds me of the scriptures that talk about the visiting the curses of the sin on generations, the third and fourth generation, that God talks about. Just the idea that, when we carry our sin and we hold on to it and our children witness it or they're part of it, it's going to become part of them too. And I think that's the pattern that we're seeing. So while Esau, maybe as he gets older, is forgiving and he loves his brother and he hugs him and everything else, that's probably next week's reading. There was definitely a stretch of time where people heard him talk about he wants to murder his brother, and I can only imagine how long that went on before he finally, with time and passage, just being like, oh man, I don't want to, I miss my brother, I don't want to hurt him, whatever. Seeing his life and being satisfied with what happened. And I'd like to look at the Micah passage now and really just confirm for us that Jacob's actions were sinful in the eyes of God. And I think the prophecy from Micah is given to us this week as our reading because of this reality. So in Micah chapter 1, you see that Micah is coming down to speak to the kings of Judah, visions that he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. And in verse 5, it says all this is because it opens up with God coming down and treading and all this great stuff happening, and it's really tied into the kind of end times, but just as powerful actions of God in changing the world and everything else. But in verse 5, it says, all this is because of Jacob's transgression. The use of Jacob's name here is purposeful. In later prophecies and other prophecies around, you've got other books like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Malachi and Hosea and Amos and Obadiah or whatever. You might not hear the name Jacob used, but you might hear the name Joseph used. You might hear Ephraim used, one of the sons of Joseph, in relation to naming the entire nation. And here in this prophecy, he specifically chooses the name of Jacob, Jacob's transgression and the sins of the house of Israel. And who is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? If you remember, Samaria became a nation after splitting from Solomon, and the very first thing that they did under Jeroboam as their king was to create the golden calves and to worship in the high places. And so what is being explained to us through the prophet Micah is that Jacob's transgression is the transgression of Samaria, and so it's idolatry, and the kind of the self-serving, and idolatry really just comes down to the desire to serve oneself instead of submitting to God. And that's the story of Jacob. He's someone who's looking to serve himself. He knows how important the covenant is, but in trying to gain it, he's trying to do it on his own accord by his own strength. And so he's seeking to serve himself and try to, grab that covenant, grab that blessing, grab that birthright on his own. And that's the very heart of idolatry, is trying to do all of the stuff that God has promised you on your terms. Or what does the idol say? It's to do things that you can do, and it's easy to do, right? If a idol or whatever says, oh, bring me this and that and the other thing, and wear this bracelet, and then burn this herb, and bury this under your under your bed, and then put this under your pillow, and then you'll have good luck. Those are things I can control and I can do. And so I don't have to kind of wait around and just trust God to do good things for me or whatever. I can just kind of make things happen on my own. right? And that's how idolatry can be understood. That's how I understand it. And this is, who are the high places of Judah? Or are they not Jerusalem? What he's saying is that the sins of Jacob have now spread into Judah. Remember the two separate kingdoms, and the high places of Samaria is a reference to where Jeroboam put altars and the golden calves so that people would not go back to Jerusalem to worship. He didn't want them to leave his territories to go to Jerusalem and worship, because then he thought once they got there and they saw the temple and the ark and everything else, they'd be like, oh, what are we doing? Why did we leave? Why are we worshiping in the high places? And they would then reject him as king and go back to Judah. And so that's why he created high places, golden calves, everything else that they can worship and stay there with. And now in Judah, they've built high places, but where is their high place? It's actually in Jerusalem itself. We know Solomon kind of started that. He started that tradition. He put other gods in the temple courtyards, and so the sin of Jacob has spread into Judah. And what I also noticed in verse 9 says, "For her wounds are incurable, for it has come up to Judah." That's the spreading of it has spread into Judah, has reached the gate of my people, even in Jerusalem. And then in verse 12, "For calamity has come down from Adonai to Jerusalem's gate." And that this was the beginning of the sin for the daughter of Zion. And that's a reference back again to Samaria and their sin. And all of this is being tied to whose name? It's being tied to Jacob's name. And I would like to point out to you, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "Oi" is a Tree of Life version, so they just that. "Oi, to them who scheme wickedness, who work out evil upon their beds, in the light of the morning they do it. For the power is in their hands. They covet fields, so they seize them, or houses, and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance." Is that a coincidence? The use of the name Jacob in the beginnings of sin in Samaria, and then spreading into Judah. It's not just about the idolatry and the self-service and trying to do things. It's what does that really look like? It's one thing for me to say, okay, I'm going to make sure I have good luck by wearing one sock inside out on the first day of the month. And when I wake up, I say rabbit, rabbit day. And I'm also going to keep under my pillow every tooth I ever lost. And, I'll have good luck. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to say, I want that guy's land. I want what that person over there has. How do I get this done? And in studying the dozen, right, called the Minor Prophets, Septuagint, or whatever, but in studying the dozen and the major prophets as well, what I've noticed is that not only did the people just commit idolatry, they used idolatry to get what they wanted, right? I said that earlier. And what they often wanted was more power and land and prosperity and prestige. And so they would use those other gods and the priests and whatever they could get, judges, they'd bribe them, and they would scheme ways to steal lands from people. And when you study the book of Deuteronomy, you see that this is something God doesn't want. The book of Leviticus, Jubilee, the idea that if people get into debt, you're going to forgive them and let them free and return their land to them. I mean, who wants to serve a God like that when you just want to keep that land for yourself forever? Right? And that's the heart also of what Jacob did. To them who scheme wickedness, who work out evil on their beds, in the light of the morning they do it. And that's what Rebekah and Jacob are doing. They're scheming. They're thinking, how are we going to take this thing that we want? And it says, so they oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. And again, as I said before, the end result is you're not allowing God to do his thing. God has promised the seed of Abraham. If God has chosen Abraham and his seed, and then it's going to be Isaac, and then from there going to be Jacob, why are you trying to make things happen by your own will? God will do the thing, right? All you need to do is be faithful to what he has called you to. If your brother has spurned the birthright and you see that, then, and you even get it in one way, which I don't think was evil. I think it just shows how little Esau cared. Like Jacob's like, here, have some stew, but give me your birthright. I think for Esau's response to be, what is this thing? I don't really care about anyway. And actually, when you look at his response to losing the blessing, he sounds really whiny. Oh, bless me too, Daddy, bless me too. And it's just like, what exactly was this person's demeanor and attitude? And Jacob saw that, and instead of trusting God to just, do the right thing and keep the covenant and be faithful, he schemed his own way into getting it for himself. And that's something that, as I was doing the study this week, I was like, you know what? I got to be careful with that myself. I think that's the ultimate lesson. The blessing, the promise is not achieved through my actions or any actions. Like Jacob ends up suffering consequences of it. He has to work all those years to marry Rachel. Then Laban chases him down, and Rachel keeps the idols, and then his sons and the lies that they tell, and they tell him that they kill his son, his favorite son, and again he has like a favorite son. He's like, learn a lesson, don't favorite a son, but he does, and then he has to hear that his son was murdered, and then he has to mourn the loss of his favorite son, and not only his favorite son, like only the wife he loves, only 2 kids that come from her, so it's like even more important. Like that's why he loved Joseph so much. There's a lot of stuff that happens in his life, and then with Joseph and everything kind of settles down with Joseph, but he still struggles, and he's in prison and going through Egypt. But the point is that all of these stories, what they show us is at the end of the day, it's God who has to remain faithful to his covenant, and we just have to trust him on that. When we try to make things happen on our own, we mess things up. Going back to Sarah, right, with Hagar and Ishmael, she tried to make that up on her own, get that covenant promise accomplished, and just messed it up. It's God who's going to be faithful. And I just said to, remember Abraham's covenant with God, the whole tradition there. And I don't think I actually explained this, but the idea, the tradition, the culture was 2 parties make a covenant. They cut animals in half. They, put one half of the bodies on one side, one half on the other, create a path between them, and both parties making the covenant walk between them, signifying that the covenant that they're making will last until either one of them are dead, like these animals are. So until death do us part. And when God did this covenant ritual with Abraham, everything was prepared, and then Abraham went to sleep, and he just saw this vision of God walking through as a brazen pot or whatever, a brazier, a fire, a flame, a lantern, and Abraham didn't get to walk through it. And so what God was communicating was, this covenant is dependent on me, my word, and the fact, the idea that I am not going to die. So it's going to be in perpetuity. It's going to be forever. In Genesis chapter 26, for this week's reading, you might have noticed Abimelech, didn't he make a covenant with Abraham to protect his well and the share of the land, everything else? But in chapter 26, Isaac goes, and there's all these conflicts about the wells, and the Philistines had filled in Abraham's wells out of spite, and they did that after he died. And that's because Abraham died, that covenant ended. So they will use phrases like, oh, this will be to your seed and the next. But the reality is that once the person dies, covenant's over. And so it just kind of highlights that in chapter 26. It shows you the covenants made with people have a limited lifespan, but the covenant made with God is forever. And the covenant made with people with a limited lifespan, we have to remain faithful. We have to do what we have to do to honor those covenants and those commitments, like marriage. While we're here on earth, we do our part and we keep those covenants. But when someone dies, the covenant is over. And so you're no longer obligated. But for God, this covenant comes from him. It's enacted by him, and it's secured by him. And it's something that we can't affect. He's going to make it happen. He's the one that's responsible for making it happen. And in fact, when humans try to make it happen on their own, we see messes are made. Big messes are made. Sinful messes are made. And so his covenants are important to understand in the sense of, what are they with us? What are his promises? And how do we remain faithful to his word as he promises them to us? How do we best stay faithful outside and not try to earn them on our own? And so I wanted to close with reading Romans chapter 9, verse 15. Romans chapter 9, verse 15. It says, what shall we say then? Is there is no injustice with God? Is there? May it never be. For to Moses he says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And to be honest, I read through chapter Romans 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, and I was looking at this and how Paul was, just advocating for this idea that, hey, Israel, right now, God has chosen you to bring the Gentiles to light. So that's really what the whole argument's about, this whole choosing thing and what God is doing. Is you try to make the covenant work on your own. That's what he's explaining in Romans. He's saying you're trying to make this covenant work through your law and through your works and through the Torah, and just not the Torah by itself, but just adding on to the Torah, as we see Jesus continually have to deal with. And so because of that, you've lost your place with God for a moment. It's not permanent. That's his purpose there of bringing that up, is saying, because right now it's the Gentiles who are going to receive the mercy. It's the Gentiles who's going to have the compassion. He's going to come back to you because his covenant is faithful based on his word, but he's going to come back to you. And so as I was reading all that, I was getting that in my head, and then I saw the beginning of chapter 12, verse 1. I thought, let me also read this for closing. So what is our responsibility? The covenant has been given to us. The covenant we have as Gentiles that, continues on from Abraham through Yeshua, through Jesus, his death on the cross and his resurrection, the covenant, Romans chapter 10, so skipped it, but it says, if you believe in your heart, right, that Jesus is Lord, Yeshua is Adonai, and that God raised him from the dead, this is the beginning of the walk of faith and the righteousness that's credited to you. And now what's your responsibility? Do you have to make it happen? Do you have to earn it? Do you have to secure it? Do you have to make sure? Not in those senses. In that sense, if we try doing that, we're going to probably mess it up. So what is required of us? In chapter 12, verse 1, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. To use sound judgment, as God has assigned each person to a measure of faith, and talks about gifts. And reality is that our requirement now is simply to serve him in the ways that are wholly acceptable to him. To not allow our minds to be conformed to the world and its ways of thinking, but to remain faithful to God and his ways of thinking and his ways of actions. And this goes back to the way of righteousness we talked about before with Abraham, and how he took care of the widow, the orphan, how he, and it's the poor, the sojourner, and how God, from the beginning throughout the scriptures, is big on justice. And you look at the minor prophets, or the dozen in Micah, what we saw there, you can't go around scheming to steal from other people and doing whatever you want out of selfish greed or desire and taking advantage of other people. This is the way of the world. Do not be conformed to the way of the world. Be conformed to be transformed by the Spirit of God and walk in his path and his ways. That's your responsibility. You don't need to ensure your salvation. That is a gift by faith and in righteousness, given, credited because of faith. But now what is your responsibility on earth? And you have one. It's not okay to just go ahead and keep living life however you want, because the book of Hebrews also speaks to this throughout the prophets, everywhere. If you say you believe in God, 1 John, but you can't love your brother, then what you're saying is a lie. In other words, in James also, in other words, what your words are speaking lies, because your actions will prove what you say. And so we're not trying to earn anything, but we're just, in effort through the Spirit, living according to God's will and plan on this earth. And so that's kind of the conclusion there for Paul. And you look at the life of Jacob, you look at the life of Esau, and that's what you see, is a life where one person's descendants lead to constant enemies of Israel and the people of God, how Jacob's descendants lead to the people of God, but they also are led into sin, and they're not perfect, and they actually commit the same sin. Jacob's transgression also affects them in Samaria and spreads to Judah, and this becomes a problem. And that's why the person of Jesus, who he is and what he represents as God's anointed is vital to the belief systems, either Judaism or Christianity. He is the Messiah, and he is the one that God sent to atone for our sins and show us the way so that we can then accept his message, his truth, and his light, and show others his light, and just endure until his coming. Alrighty, thank you for watching with me this week and studying with me. I'll be posting the next teaching tomorrow evening. And then until next week, God bless, and I pray that everything we're doing here is encouragement. I do want to say thank you for those who are new subscribers. It's like each week I get like 2 or 3 more subscribers, so that's awesome. And I really thank you for doing that. And if you know anybody who just likes to study scripture without the politics of it, just wanting, or even denominational viewpoints and everything else, I'm trying my best to try to just present what the scriptures are saying, and hopefully open up to future discussions where more people can be interactive and stuff like that. So yes, please share with your friends, family, anyone else that you think just like to study the scriptures and would like to jump in with us here on the I Am Barabbas podcast. Thank you again for watching, and God bless.